This is Nice Work. I'm Alex Chambers, and I'm here with my co-host, Tyler Lake. Tyler, what do we have today?
We have an interview our colleague Kayte Young did back in April with ceramicist Claire Miller.
Yes, and I wish Kayte could introduce this herself, but she is no longer with us. She died at the end of May. But this interview is lively and surprising and thoughtful, and like so many of Kayte's interviews, it offers some great insight into the creative process.
Yeah, Alex, I love how Miller goes into the studio 5 days a week like it's a non-negotiable for her.
Yeah, it's inspiring.
A little bit, huh?
Also inspiring, sculptor Melanie Pennington created a sculpture of AIDS activist Ryan White, and it was unveiled this week at the Indiana Memorial Union.
I talked to Pennington right as she was finishing up on the work back in January.
I'm excited to listen to all of that. It's coming up on Nice Work after this.
This is Nice Work. I'm Tyler Lake. Claire Miller makes fragile ceramic works that play with the precarity of porcelain and force both her and the user to carefully consider the object as they interact with it. Her work sometimes feels sculptural, sometimes almost like patchwork assemblage, sometimes organic, lifelike, almost floral, maybe. She builds a purposeful, ragged imperfection into her works. They beg the hand to be gentle, and they ask for concentration. These are simple objects full of tactile sensation that almost demand that you slow down just for a moment to give them just a little bit more of your divided attention. Nice Work host Kayte Young sat down with Claire Miller to talk about her work and how imperfection might just be what it takes to get something right. And I want to note, this interview took place in April. Kayte Young died just a few weeks ago at the end of May. Here's Kayte Young and Claire Miller.
Welcome to Nice Work.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. And to start with, I would like to hear a little bit about your background and what got you into ceramics.
Yeah. So I think since I was really young, I've been a creative person, and I grew up in a family where I think that was really cultivated. My dad is an architect, but he's really just a tinkerer and I think he's a very creative person. He's a tinkerer and he's a builder. And then my mom is a calligrapher, and my mom taught calligraphy in the community college system and the college system where I grew up. And so I think I grew up in a home where we were exposed to a lot of different art materials and ways of making and art being a part of your life. And I think I didn't have exposure to ceramics, really, other than sort of a few assignments in grade school and middle school. And then when I went to undergrad, I was I think I was really determined to not study art. And I think in part because I went to a high school, unfortunately, that had pretty poor visual arts. And so I just was really turned off from that in high school. This is sort of how I've made a lot of decisions in my life. Like, I wake up one morning and I'm like, I need to do this. Mm-hmm. And I was in undergrad going into junior year, I think, and I was studying anthropology. And I just woke up one morning, I was like, I need to take a ceramics class. So I signed up, but it was full. So I just went on the first day, and luckily somebody dropped it.
Wow.
That was really my introduction to ceramics, was in undergrad. And luckily I had an amazing teacher, Walter Zerko, who's still, I consider, a friend and a mentor. And yeah, I went to a really small school, so there wasn't necessarily a huge ceramics program, but I just continued to take ceramics classes from that point on.
What was like the first kind of work that you did? Like, were you working on a wheel or were you working by, hand?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because it's actually, I feel like, really important to me and how I work now. So a lot of times, intro ceramics classes, they start with a pinched assignment, and then, because pinching is oftentimes seen as sort of the most fundamental or rudimentary way of working in ceramics. And so oftentimes you start there and then you move into a couple different hand building techniques, and then from there sort of spend the last half of the semester like learning how to use the wheel. And so our first assignment was a pinched bowl. And I just remember sitting in the studio and like working on this bowl kind of indefinitely. Like I never wanted it to be over. I loved the feeling so much. And I think it was intended to be an assignment that you moved through really quickly. And I just loved the way it felt to pinch, which is now the way I work. Mm-hmm. But from there, we moved into other ways of making, and we were introduced to the wheel, and I got really hooked on that. And so it wasn't really until about maybe 10 years later, or maybe a little less than that, that I actually returned, like that pinching actually became a part of my process again. Right. I was mostly throwing from that point on. But that pinching assignment, now I think about it of like, oh, it took me a really long time, but I was just trying to return to that feeling of sitting there pinching clay.
Since this is radio and our listeners can't see your work in front of them, I think it's important to describe some of your work and just kind of what it looks like as finished work, and then we can talk more about the process in a minute. But yeah, could you describe sort of the current work that you're doing now?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different types of clays that you can work with. I use a porcelain, so it's a clay that's really bright white and smooth. And if you hold it up to light, oftentimes you can see light pass through the clay or the ceramic surface. I leave a lot of my work unglazed on the exterior, so it almost looks like a bright white polished stone, the finished surface. And then in terms of forming my work, I am, I guess, in the camp of being a hand builder. And so I'm mostly working with pinching. Sometimes I'm working with like thin slabs that I pinch the edges of. I see the work I make as pottery and different pots, though I think they also have a particular fragility to them because I work the clay until it's really thin. And sometimes forms I make also have a particular precarity to sort of how they stand. So I think sometimes people look at it and they wonder, is this a pot or is this a mug? I think it kind of can throw that into question, but I see it that way. And then a sort of question that oftentimes motivates how I'm making decisions in the forms I make is I oftentimes try to have two somewhat opposing ways of touching clay in every object. So whether it's a sharpness and a softness sort of joined together. That's not always present, but that's sort of a goal that I'm always trying to work towards when making decisions in my work.
And so some of the work that I've seen that you've done is sort of small cups that sort of get a little wider at the top, very thin, like you said, and some of them have kind of a pale yellow glaze on the inside, but the exterior is white, like you said, just the clay. And then there's also sometimes a really thin painted pattern in black on the outside of like little, almost looks like little beads strung, but like in lines. And then I've also seen candle holders of various kinds, sometimes like stacked discs of different sizes and roughness or whatever, stacked. And then, like you said, kind of precarious, like it doesn't look as sort of uniform and stable. And so it has that kind of that precarity. And all of them feel very fragile and delicate to me, most of the work that I've seen that you've done. And I've also seen some where like thin slabs are kind of layered against each other, like to either make a dish or maybe a mug or a bowl where little pieces are kind of, they're not smoothed out necessarily. You can kind of see where the different pieces have connected.
Yeah, and I think you can oftentimes see the mark of my finger in them. Or like if you look closely, you could see my fingerprints all over the surface of the work. I make pinch pots, but I also think, like what you're describing, sometimes the work is made from a single ball that's sort of expanded, like the mug or the cup that you described. And other times my work is more sort of an assemblage of different pieces of clay that are attached together, like the candlestick or the mug that you were describing.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good description of the kind of work that I've seen that you're doing. So now we could talk a little bit more, kind of get into depth about your process. And so you said the cups are a single piece of clay that's been expanded. So could you just talk about that a little bit more? Like, it's not like you have a base and then you're wrapping sides around it. It's like the whole thing is one.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think it's just a beautiful idea to work in a way that is expansive, and for it to literally be that. And I think oftentimes art processes are described as being sort of either additive, where you're starting with something, you're adding to it, or subtractive, where maybe in the example of someone who's working in stone, you start with a block and then you're subtracting from that to make the form. Making those cups or bowls also that I make, I start with a single ball of clay and I never am adding or subtracting from that ball. I'm just slowly moving it from a solid ball into this open form, which I think of it as this process of expanding. And I just really love having that word in my process of it being an expansive process.
Yeah. It sounds like from the beginning of your connection to ceramics, how something's made and what you're doing when you're making it is a big part of, I mean, maybe that's true for every artist in every art form. I don't know, but it just seems to me that it matters to you to have that connection to how you're doing it and what it is, or just like how you were describing the expansiveness. Or I noticed in some of the cups there are, and maybe the bowls too, there's sometimes a visible patch.
Oh, yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, also what you were just saying, it makes me think about how oftentimes I think about my relationship with clay as really a friendship. And as I'm working, it oftentimes feels like I'm hanging out with a friend. And it feels so deeply personal, and that we're just trying to sort of get to know each other. And so it's nice to hear you sort of reflect that in a different way. I feel like in grad school, so often there's this sort of pressure to have some sort of complicated reason why you're using the material you're using. And I think I realized, I'm at the end of grad school, I was like, I work with clay because I love it. And that's all.
Yeah.
And so, with that, like the patches that you're describing on the work, I think of them as Band-Aids. So sometimes, especially through that process of expansion, I'll get little cracks on the surface of the pot. And I think initially my instinct was, I have to start over again. But I also work really slowly, and it doesn't really make sense to always just be starting over again. And so I started putting these little pinched patches over the crack. And sometimes there are other little cracks on the surface that are, not an issue, and I'll leave those ones just exposed. But if I ever see a crack forming that I think, this could be an issue as the object dries, and it could make a bigger crack than makes the piece not usable, then I'll put a little, what I call Band-Aid over it. And something I like about that process too is if I had to decide where those went, I think I would find it really overwhelming making that decision. But because the crack just emerges in the process, then I know exactly where it goes. I don't have to, I guess I'm making a decision to put it there, but I don't have to make a decision of whether or not I'm putting it on it or not.
Yeah, where you're putting it. Yeah. Yeah, and it feels to me like the presence of the artist is in that object now for the person who might have that object or, just experience it. Mm-hmm. There's this really visible, like, oh, a person made this and had this issue and this is how they decided to deal with it. And it also just adds a different texture and, it's interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes I get a little bit sad when cracks don't form when I'm making it because then I don't have anywhere to put a Band-Aid.
Right.
And I think I can be kind of rigid. So I'm not going to deviate from my rule of not, if a crack isn't there, I can't put a Band-Aid on it.
Right. You're not just going to randomly go, oh, this piece would look good with one of those little Band-Aids on it. Yeah. That's interesting. I would like to go back to what you were saying about the materials and choosing it because you love it, because it does seem to me like you work mostly with porcelain.
Yes.
And so do you have a particular love of porcelain? And what are some of the qualities about it that draw you to it?
Yeah. So I think part of it is that I want the exterior surface to be unglazed just because it makes the marks on the surface and how it was formed so much more present. And you could leave any clay unglazed on the exterior or any ceramic surface unglazed on the exterior. But I think porcelain lends itself to that particularly well because it's hardly absorbent once it's fired. So it's not going, if someone's actually using it as a cup, it's not going to take in, liquids and that sort of thing through use. So there's this sort of more technical aspect of it. But I also really love the idea of light being able to pass through the work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another quality that you'll find in porcelain that you wouldn't necessarily find in other clays that you're going to be working with. And then part of it is the sort of kiln I have access to. I use an electric. There are a lot of different types of kilns. Right now I use an electric kiln. And so maybe if I had access to a different type of kiln and different method of firing, I would be using a different clay. But right now I think it makes the most sense for sort of what I have access to.
Does porcelain, is it fired at a lower temperature or not as long or?
No. You can, I think typically like a true porcelain would actually be fired to a really high temperature. But it's more like if, in grad school I had access to like every type of kiln I wanted to use. And then I did experiment with other types of firing and other clays. But then as I sort of transitioned out of grad school, it became very obvious. So like, okay, this is sort of how I work, or this is the material that I'm using. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think the idea of an object being able to be illuminated, or even like with the cups I make, I love when sometimes they're just sitting on my counter or I'm using it in the sun and you can see the light passing through.
And so the cups are usable, like you could drink out of them, all of them.
Yeah.
Whether they're glazed inside or not.
Well, I always glaze things on the inside so that people, feel like they can use them, whether or not they use them.
Or whether or not they needed that.
Yeah.
It's for the person who has it, they're not going to use it if it's not glazed.
Yeah. Do you use, because you have one of those little cups.
I did not know I could use it. I have it on display in my house.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people, because my work is really fragile, I think people don't use it as a cup. It might be they might use it as you are, more as a decorative cup.
Well, you're changing my mind about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of really fragile little glasses that I love to use and little bowls and stuff. So I feel like I would probably really enjoy using it. So I might try it.
Yeah, you can try it now.
I might move it to the kitchen.
Yeah. I'll have I have a cup that's of mine that's very similar to the one I think you have, and I'll have like a little bit of kombucha in it or kefir or things that I have little, that I drink little bits of.
Yeah.
I drink it out of that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, it is a funny thing.
But I think I would really enjoy experiencing it in that way rather than just having it sitting as an art object that I just look at.
Yeah. I should put a little note inside of everything when I sell it. You can use this.
Yeah. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your process of working, like when I've seen your shows or there's a ceramic sale at the Eiffel that I've been to. There's a lot of repetition, which you often see in pottery and in ceramics, but it feels a little different when it's all hand built. And you see because every object is unique, even if you're repeating the form, like those cups.
Yeah.
And I would just love to hear you talk about that process a little bit.
So I guess I should say I came to Bloomington to go to graduate school and study ceramics. And when I came here, I wasn't pinching entirely at the time. I was sort of in this weird transition phase. And I think I was still very much trying to be a sort of traditional potter who I saw as someone who made sort of the whole canon of pottery and could make every form. And so I would go into my studio and I would think, okay, today I'm going to make this many cups, this many plates, this many bowls. I'm going to try again to make a teapot, even though every teapot I've ever made is terrible. And I just was really, I remember my first big critique of grad school. I had so many different types of object in there. And I think it wasn't necessarily helping me grow, though I don't think I knew that at the time. So every semester of grad school in my program, you had one critique. And so you were just sort of always working towards this one big presentation of your work. And my third critique or fourth critique of grad school, maybe, I started to really focus in on, I think that's when repetition became such a prominent part of my work. And it's really kind of strange, but I love finding things on the ground. Like if I see a note on the ground, I have to look at it. And one day I found a note on the ground that said 8 or 10 essays a day, 8 days, something, 88 essays, go. And I picked this up and I took it to my studio because I was like, this is really curious. It's like clearly a teacher sort of brainstorming an assignment. And I took it to my studio and I put it on my wall. And I was in my studio and it had been there for a while. And I was struggling to figure out what I was going to be making next. And I had recently made this weird kind of chalice form. And for some reason, I looked at that note and I decided that I would make 88 of that same form, which was really different than how I had worked previously. In the past, I would have probably thought, I'll make 10 of this form. And that would have been it, and then I would have made 10 of something else.
Is that just a practice of ceramics and that you repeat? You have a series of things, or you know how to make cups, and so you make a bunch of cups. You know how to make a plate. You make a bunch of plates.
Yeah, I guess I should say that too. I think it's something of that would be characteristic of people who are making pots.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is, I guess that's an important point, is like repetition is already, I think, a part of sort of how you're taught, but repetition to the extent of 88 was not a part of it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it wasn't an unusual concept to think, oh, I'm going to make more. I'm going to repeat this form again.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just started making this same form over and over and over again. And I think for my crit, I did make 88 of them. And it was such a curious process because the form, without me knowing it, changed so much over the course of making 88 of them. And what's really like a sweet part of that story, after I finished it, I was looking at the note and I was like, I think I know whose note this is. And it's Froske's.
I was going to say, it sounds like it.
Yeah. And I was like, and I was taking some classes. I had taken some classes with him in grad school. And so eventually I was like, wait, is this yours? And he was like, oh, yeah, I guess I lost that. And it was so cool because he's such an important teacher to me. And that I just happened to intercept this assignment that was on the sidewalk. And that it's become a part of my practice. And so that same form, ultimately, I tried other forms in graduate school, and I continued to work in a similar manner where I would just say, okay, I'm making this form, and now I'm going to make this particular number. And it wouldn't necessarily be 88, but it would definitely be a number that felt like it was a stretch.
Yeah.
And then ultimately for my thesis show in grad school, I returned to that same form. You know, by the time I finished grad school, I probably had made like 300 of that same form. And again, it just, even from when I started actually making the work for my thesis show to when I had finished making it, I think I made 150 of the same object. Like even over that iteration of that assignment, it changed so much.
And how, like, what are we talking about in terms of time? Like, is it taking you days to make one, or is it taking you a few hours to make one? And I know that there's multiple processes, so it's probably not that easy to say it takes this long to make one, because it's not like start to finish, you just sit down and make it.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it really depends on the object and also how much sort of time I can be in the studio each day. Sometimes there is a minimum of a couple hours in every piece.
Right.
With the candlestick forms, it's more like a couple days.
And so I'm just thinking about like, okay, you're on number 15.
Yeah.
I can picture that. When you're on number 50 and you still have going for 88, like what's happening with your mind and your hands, and like what's your relationship to the clay and the objects at that point? Like how are you feeling? And
I think what's amazing for me in working in that way, because even now I still work in that way, and I think I realized it helped my work to really focus. Sometimes I would be in the studio and I'd think, I want to try this other thing, but to just say, no, you can't do that until you've completed this other thing. I think that's really helpful for me and makes the work stronger. But I also think by giving myself that task or that assignment or that constraint, I also learned how to always show up to the studio. And so it didn't matter what was happening internally or in the world or it didn't matter how I felt. I knew I always had something to do in the studio. And for that to not be something that I ever negotiated was really important to me, because I think it helps the work then contain sort of all of yourself and all versions of yourself when you're always showing up to work towards this goal, even on days when it sort of feels like you have no business being in the studio because you're so sad or heartbroken or whatever it might be.
Oh, that's really interesting to think about. Like when you said, no, I can't do that. And you said earlier, you talked about rules, but what you're really talking about is constraints.
Yes.
You've set the terms for your practice for a period of time or a quantity of objects or something, you know? And then cutting out that negotiation probably would really strengthen your practice, you know, because you don't have to go through that every time. You know what you're going to do when you show up.
Exactly.
And that's still how you work.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of leads me to another question I had. I know that you have another job. You know, you're employed at the university, at Indiana University. So what does your kind of day in the life look like in terms of art making and your job?
Yeah. So the word negotiation is also in sort of my answer to this. I work in my studio in the morning before I go to work. So I work here at IU from 9 to 5, and I work in my studio from like 7:15, 7:30 until just before 9. And that hasn't always been the case. I've tried working at other times of day, but I've found working before work means that, again, I always go to the studio. A few years ago, I had a meditation teacher who, over the course of several months, taught different mindfulness techniques. And sort of at the end of our time together, he asked our class, what are non-negotiable things in your life? And he said, non-negotiable in the way that sleeping is, or eating is, or even brushing your teeth is. And I know that ultimately he was sort of asking us to consider how can some of these mindfulness techniques you've learned be integrated into your life in a way that's non-negotiable. And I was really moved by that question. It prompted me to reflect so much on, what are the things that I currently do in my life that are non-negotiable? Even as far as like making coffee every morning, you know? So even things that I sort of categorize differently than maybe brushing my teeth.
Sure.
Yeah. Like I wake up, I put my glasses on, I turn the same 3 lights on, and then I make my coffee. And at the time I was transitioning into a new job, and I was really curious about what that would mean in terms of being in the studio. So I reflected a lot on how can being in the studio become a non-negotiable part of my day and my routine. And I realized that at this time in my life, no one ever asks me to do something before work. And I oftentimes had struggled in the past, especially with working full-time outside of the studio, with how the studio often felt like it was competing with other things. So, like today after work, I want to go to an event. And in the past, I would have thought, when I had sort of thought, well, I'll go to the studio after work, it always felt like those things were competing, whether it was going to an event or hanging out with a friend or making dinner. But by working in my studio before I go to work, it just has become a part of my routine. And it's become something that I never even think about doing. I just wake up, I go through my whole sort of morning routine of having coffee and getting ready for the day, and then I go to the studio, and I usually work for around an hour and a half. And something that's so great about it is that I oftentimes almost forget that I went to the studio, because it's just kind of like I don't think, oh, did I brush my teeth today? Or did I have coffee today? I just know I did those things.
Yeah.
Oftentimes that's sort of how going to the studio feels.
And when you get there, you don't have to think too much about what you're going to do. You already know.
Yeah.
And when do you decide that?
Yeah. So usually...
Like before you go to bed or something?
Well, I mean, usually it's just like, I know I'm working in a series of something. And unless I'm, finished with that series, then I have a decision about what I'm going to do next. But I also think by sort of, as I was describing, if when I have a new idea pop up as I'm working on something and being like, nope, can't do that right now, I think I'm then sort of saving ideas for later so that when I actually finish making, 50 of that cup, which can take me, a couple of months, I have ideas already percolating and forming that I want to move to.
Yeah.
So this morning when I went to the studio, I just unwrapped the candlestick that I've been working on for the last couple days and just continued working. And I don't know if being in the studio will always take this form, but I find for this time in my life, it works really well.
Yeah, and then I would imagine if you have a show and there's other kinds of work that you have to do besides just making the thing, that you probably have other days where you're just like, okay, I'm just getting ready for this thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's a good point. Sometimes it is different, or sometimes I have to pack things up, which is like my least favorite thing to do. So some days it does look different. I think by having those sort of non-negotiable hours in my week of studio time, it doesn't mean that those are my only hours. Right. So oftentimes if I do have a deadline, I will work on the weekends or I'll work after work. And when I first started my current job, I thought, I'll have these short intervals in the studio Monday through Friday. And then on the weekend, I'll have longer periods in the studio. And then I really quickly realized I wanted to also have a weekend. Like I didn't want to work every day of the week.
Yeah.
So oftentimes I just go into the studio on the weekends if I have a deadline or sort of those other sorts of tasks that you're describing of packing work or making glaze or things that aren't actually forming objects.
Yeah. And your studio's not at your home, it's elsewhere.
Yeah, I would love to have a studio at my home, but my house is very small.
Well, I think some people kind of like it being separated too. So I was just curious.
It is really nice having it be separate, but ultimately I would love for it to be at home, because I also think it would be easier to come and go from things. Sometimes I think after dinner, like, I could go work in the studio for an hour. And if it was at home, I think I might do that.
Yeah. I was thinking about the objects and their fragileness and I don't know. I guess my question is something about how you want the work to be received by other people. Like I think we've talked quite a bit about how what your relationship is to making them. And I wonder what thoughts you have about, I don't know, what they're doing out in the world.
I'm glad you brought that up, because ultimately, I do make things and I don't intend to just keep them in my studio. I want for them to go into the world and find new homes. And I think something that really moves me in how I make objects is, I think, ultimately sort of coming from that question. So in the sort of way in which I was taught in ceramics, especially when you're working on the wheel, is to think about pots in terms of how can they be generous towards the user? And, how does the lip feel? How does the handle feel? How easy is it to clean? All of those things being geared towards the person who's using it. And I think in my work, subconsciously or maybe unconsciously, I almost sort of subverted that, where I began to wonder, how can the object teach me about itself? So how can the object teach me how it wants to be held and used and cared for? How can an object ask me to be more careful? I think that is really present in sort of the fragility of my work and the precarity of my work, is that I think it can sort of arrest your preconceptions of what a mug is or how a cup is and how you might interact with it. And that, yes, you might have to hold it more carefully, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I will, on occasion, have these really, really intense and beautiful interactions with people who are, I think, see some part of themselves in what I'm making. And oftentimes it does have to do with sort of that question of what does it mean to hold something that's more fragile than yourself? Sometimes it can be like a really intense and moving interaction that I don't think I would get to have if I made work that had a particular sort of traditional like strength or rigidity, like
Heft.
Yeah,
That's what I'm
heft to
thinking
it.
of.
Yeah. Every time I have those interactions, I feel really lucky. Other times people will be like, I'm so intimidated by your work, which I also think is really interesting because, again, I'm like, it's okay to hold something that's fragile.
That was Claire Miller talking with our late colleague, Kayte Young, back in April. If you want to check Claire's work out, you can find it at clairemiller.art. More nice work after this. A statue of Ryan White was unveiled at the Indiana Memorial Union at IU Bloomington this week. It was created by sculptor and senior lecturer Melanie Pennington. I spoke with her a few months back as she was finishing up work on the piece, and she talked a lot about capturing the incredible aura of White, and she goes into a lot of detail of just how painstaking the bronze casting process can be. So, here's my conversation with sculptor Melanie Pennington. Ryan White was a teenager in Kokomo when he contracted AIDS from a blood transfusion in 1984. He was, by all accounts, a remarkable human being. He seemed to understand the role he could play in the AIDS epidemic, seemed to grasp that America wasn't ready to take AIDS seriously. It was a disease that ravaged the gay community, and, well, the country didn't really seem to care. White understood that he could bring attention to the cause, and that he could help change things. And he did. Ryan worked tirelessly to the end of his too short life to help destigmatize HIV and AIDS. A remarkable human being, as fitting as anyone I can think of to be memorialized. And a bronze sculpture of White is in the works, created by artist and senior lecturer of sculpture at the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design, Melanie Pennington. Those of us of a certain age know the name Ryan White, and Hoosiers probably more than most. But I wondered for Cooper Pennington, who grew up in Boston, what came to mind when she heard his name before being commissioned for this work.
So I was in elementary school, and I remember the toilet seats. People were just afraid. They were afraid of toilet seats. They were afraid of cups. They were afraid of AIDS. They were afraid of HIV. And I was aware of Ryan mostly as just some young guy out there that was friends with Michael Jackson. Like that was really all I knew. You know, I don't think I was that keyed into what was happening. I just knew he was a celebrity.
You're sort of at the end of the process.
Yep.
What's your take now?
Well, I titled the sculpture Keep Going for very, very specific reasons. After having spent time getting to know Ryan, really just spending a lot of time in his presence. So my studio walls right now have about, 100 photographs of him just plastered everywhere. And his eyes are so beautiful and penetrating and kind and constant. And I don't quite know how to describe it, but there was something about Ryan. Ryan had a steadiness, a very calm posture and perspective, and his personality was quite calm and steady, like above his age in terms of maturity. The one thing I noticed most was that he was always in motion. I mean, that's partly because the interviews were always trying to capture him. He's trying to get from A to B, but always encouraging other people, always educating other people, educating teachers, educating politicians, educating students. Like everything out there about Ryan is movement. For that reason, he's in the posture he's in the sculpture. He's moving forward. He's got the backpack slung over his shoulder. He's looking back like, hey, let's go. So it was the calmness of his personality, the confidence that he carried himself with, and the kindness. And he was also a teenage boy. I've had a teenage boy. So I could recognize that side of him as well. It was nice.
If you kind of talked to anyone who knew Ryan, there was something special. People said this. There was something extraordinary just about his presence. And now you're meant to capture that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is why I didn't breathe until his mom came and felt him. Yeah. I mean, I can't, I'm a bit speechless about it, and because I knew that, and I could feel it without having met him. It was about 3 weeks before his mom was supposed to come to my studio, and I was staring at Ryan, praying to Ryan, like, because I still hadn't gotten him. I was like, Ryan, I don't think you don't look cool enough yet, and this is not you. Like, help me make you look cool. He always wanted to look cool, and he was cool. And it was only in the last 2 weeks that I got it. And then it was only when Jeannie and Andrea saw it that I could believe that I got it.
Just to note, Jeannie is Ryan's mom and Andrea is his sister.
And even now, because it'll change in the bronze, even now I'm not done yet. I don't feel done yet.
Do we know yet when this is probably when it's going to be installed?
Ryan died on April 8th. So I'm hoping that either on that day or that week or weekend we'll have a unveiling.
And when that statue goes up, it'll live in the Indiana Memorial Union on the IU Bloomington campus. Walk me through the process of creating a bronze. It seems like so intimidating.
Step one is creating a maquette. They're about 6 inches in size. And then from that, I work with models to finalize the posture. With Ryan, it was really difficult. He didn't grow properly because of both the hemophilia and the AIDS, having acquired that at age 12. So I had to work with very slight people to model for me, casting the body, positioning the body according to what I want, dressing the body. It was really helpful for me to go to his bedroom exhibit at the Children's Museum. And this was heartbreaking. His locker is there with slander all over the locker, but hanging in the locker is one of his coats. So I was in there with my scarf, measuring the length of the sleeve. I cast a foam mannequin body without the head, without the hands. I clothe that body, and then I coat the clothing in glue, basically. I build a head armature, I build hand armatures, and I coat all of it with a plasticine. It's an oil-based clay. Then I've got the whole clay sculpt completed. Mom came and gave her seal of approval, which was just the most touching thing I've experienced ever. We both cried for about 4 minutes. His sister also was there, and they both they loved it. So that was amazing. And then in the last 3 weeks, I had to cut the sculpture into 5 pieces. With a mold maker, Jared Smith, we had to cut through like the shoulder. We had to take off the head, take off the hands, take off pieces of the backpack. Then we coat those in layers of rubber, and then we coat the rubber with a rigid plastic shell. And then I ship the rubber molds with the mother mold out to my foundry, Bollinger Atelier in Arizona. And they will cast it, and I will go out there and I'll approve the wax. And then they melt out the wax, pour in the liquid bronze, weld the bronze pieces together, I get to approve that, and then I go and I help with the patina. And then they ship it back. So yeah, it's about an 8-step process and a constructing and deconstructing of the piece 3 different times.
If you haven't seen Melanie's work, you can check it out at melaniepennington.com. Nice Work is a production of WFIU, WTIU, and Indiana Public Media. You can find us at ipm.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
If you like smart conversations, you'll like The State of Inquiry.
It's not just ChatGPT.
Marital satisfaction, how memory changes with age.
Social media, or to TikTok, or to influencers.
Strife, discord, and conflict.
Enjoyment, motivation.
Cascading effects on rural communities.
Safe drinking water.
What can we do to deter changes?
It looks pretty, but it doesn't mean it's good.
The State of Inquiry, wherever you find podcasts and at ipm.org.